Installing and implementing Tomcat for Servlet and JSP development, part 2. What we're going to do in the second part of learning how to work with Tomcat is now focus in on setting up the development environment so we can run Java web applications. In the first part of this, we learned how to download, install, and configure the Tomcat application server. Now what we're going to start to do is focus in on how we're going to utilize a very specific component of Tomcat for Java web applications. So you've heard me mention the expression Java web applications, I'm sure, several times now. So what exactly is that? Well, a Java web application, as its definition, is what I'm going to start off with when we start talking about Java web applications and what that really entails. Because, you know, there's two types of definitions. There's this kind of concrete, meat and potatoes, how do I actually point and click and what do I type of a definition, more of an operational type of a definition, and then there's a conceptual definition, and I'm going to give you both of them. Then we're going to start talking about the directory structure that web apps are supposed to have, and you'll see that the definition of a web app or a web application, specifically according to the Java specifications, really is very connected to, tightly coupled to, if you will, a very specific directory structure. Then I've got something titled called This is War. Java has a really cool ability of creating what are called web application archive files, and those are WAR files. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a couple of different tools available to us to start deploying our Java web applications onto the Tomcat server. So what exactly is a web application? What exactly is a Java web application? Well, the Java Servlet specification version 2.2 kind of brought into light the whole idea of a web application. So it's relatively new to the whole concept of JSP and Java web development. And basically what they define a web application is, as a web application is a collection of servlets, HTML pages, classes, and other resources that can be bundled and run on multiple containers from multiple vendors. Now that's a lot of, you know, it's typical of some company to write some, kind of a definition that we can barely understand. But that's what it is, and I wanted you to hear it right from the horse's mouth. But honestly, to us, basically, it's going to be something that lives on a web application server like Tomcat, and it allows us to host web applications that allow us to do things like interface with databases, interface with email servers, e-commerce, things like that. So let's kind of understand what a web application is in a very common sense term. It is a collection of servlets, HTML pages, and classes because, quite honestly, that's what we're going to build. Now, here's the deal. A web application has a boundary, okay? So all of our servlets, which are class files that become when compiled, they are our HTML files, our .htmls, if you will. There could be .jsp files. They could be .js files for JavaScript files. Oh, .cascading style sheet files. There are various files that make up one web application. And it's a boundary, and the boundary is the servlet context. And you can only have one and one only servlet context per each web application. And the following you can think about in terms of web applications. They're going to be a collection of servlets, JSP pages, other classes, XHTML, images, JPEGs, GIFs. So let me get that in there. Here's a .gif file, let's say, or a .jpeg. Anything, but it is limited to and bounded by a servlet context. Continuing with our discussion on how to define a Java web application, a more concrete, more tangible definition of a Java web application is its directory structure. A Java web application has to have, by the standards, a directory structure laid out like this. And on the left side, I've got written for you essentially the standard. And then on the right side, I have for you sort of an example here, and we'll kind of build this together as we go along here. But what does the standard say? Well, the standard says to go into our Catalina home directory, and that would be wherever it is we installed Tomcat. Now, we installed ours, basically we uncompressed it, if you recall, at the root of C, which created for us this Jakarta Tomcat 5.5.4 directory. Now, in there, we have a web apps directory. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a folder in there, or a directory, whatever we want it, like RB2. And in there, we're going to create a very special directory called web-inf. And it is extremely case sensitive. So instead of looking at the whiteboard here, let me hop out and let's go into my uh, directory here. So let's go into the run dialog box here. And let's go to C Jakarta, and we'll go into the web apps directory. And this is what was installed for us by default. Okay, none of this stuff I built. If you recall, we expanded the Tomcat zip file that we downloaded in the last video, and we expanded it to C colon, which put it at the root of C and created this Jakarta-Tomcat-5.5.4 directory, and web apps was a subdirectory that came with it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my own. So I'll call this RB test 1. Now, that will become the name of the application. Now, the web application inside of that folder has to have a very special directory called web-inf in all caps. Inside of the web-inf folder, I need to have two more directories. One called classes. This will be where my classes will go that I'm going to be using for my application. If I've archived them, I can put them inside of the lib directory. And the lib directory is going to contain all my Java archive files, where the classes directory is basically where my servlet and other classes I create will be stored. For example, you know what I might want to put in the lib directory for those Java archive files? A Java archive file, recall, has a .jar file extension. Could be things like my JDBC drivers. Now, there's another thing that's absolutely critical when it comes to setting up a web application, a very special file. And this special file is the web application deployment descriptor. And it does things like, oh, define where I'm going to have session configuration. Maybe I want to specify timeout for a session. It allows me to define servlets and JSP definitions, servlet and JSP mappings, maybe a welcome file list, any kind of custom error pages I want to have, any kind of security information. All of it goes in this web.xml file. If you're at all familiar with ASP.NET, there's a web.config file, which I think has some parallels here. But anyways, the web application deployment descriptor file is called web.xml, and it lives inside of this web-inf directory. So as you recall, we created those directories. Now, we can have a very complicated web.xml file, or we can have a very simple one. Let's go back into my newly created web-inf file, and I'm in the web-inf directory, rather, and I'm going to say File, New, and I'm going to say Text Document, and I'm going to create this simple little XML file. Now, I'm going to create just a very basic one at first. So I'm going to open it up in Notepad, and I'm going to go ahead and type it out. I'm going to say XML version equals 1.0, and I'm going to say web app, and I'm going to close the web app directory. Save that off. All right, yes, I want to save it. Now, something else I'm going to put into my web application. Remember, the web application is not necessarily stored in the web-inf. See, watch this. I'm going to create a test HTML page. So I'll say test.html. And yep, I want that to be a .html. I'm going to right click on it, pump it into Notepad, and I'm going to say body bg color equals, how about, blue, and for color, or text rather, equals, white. If I could spell white. And I'll say, I'm not going to do hello world. How about hi everybody? All right. And I'll go ahead and quit that, save that. Now let me minimize everything, and we're pretty good to go here, so let's minimize that. Now, if you recall, you can see down below here, I don't have my little Tomcat DOS window going, so which tells me that I don't have Tomcat started. So I'm going to go into the tomcat/bin directory, and in there is the startup bat file. Okay, so I'm going to start that up. Windows XP Service Pack 2 is like, is this okay for me to run? Is this some kind of security thing? Nope, rather go ahead and run it. So I clicked run. And now what's going to happen is it's going to start the web service. And server startup in 7,841 milliseconds. That's not too bad to start up a server, huh? So I'm going to go to HTTP localhost colon 8080. And what in the world, I already forgot, I called it RB test 1. Boy, my memory, huh? RB test 1 and test.html. Let's see what we get here. And ta-da, here we go. That's the essential part of building a web application and configuring Tomcat to do that. Now, you can see here, this in fact, this is really working. It's coming from HTTP. We've specified the name of the server. I'm going to want to change that 8080 because Tomcat's the only one I'm running. Now, if you have multiple web servers running, don't change the port from 8080. And then I'm going to go to the name of my application, which is rbtest1, and I'm going to go to the test.html file. All right, so that's utilizing and setting up Tomcat in that fashion. Now, there's one last thing I want to show you. And that's where I entitled that section, This is War. And a war file is a pretty cool deal. A war file is a web archive file. And I can create that using a command line tool, and that basically, if you will, archives all of my web application into a single WAR file. And then what I can do is I can deploy a war file to Apache Tomcat. So let me jump out into CMD, or yeah, let's go to my DOS prompt, and we'll go to my CD, my web apps. Let's do a dir, and oh, you know what? I created that in Jakarta. So let's go CD Jakarta, and go into web apps. Do a dir. There's my Robert test 1. Let's go into that. RB test 1. And watch this. Jar, compress, verify, or compress, verify, and verbose mode, essentially. Here, let me back this up so you can see. C is create new archive, compress. V is generate verbose, and F is specify the file name. So we're going to do a jar CVF, and I'm going to call it Robert, or rather rbtest1.war, and I'm going to just do star.start, put everything. And you can see it's going to add everything into there. Now if I do a dir, I've got a rbtest1.war file, or WAR file. And later on, I'm going to show you how you can actually simplify Tomcat Java web application deployment to Tomcat using WAR files. Okay, the next thing I want to do is I want to start showing you a little bit more about what is involved with configuring Tomcat specifically for servlets and JSPs. Now, I've shut down some folders here, and I've kind of pre-configured my server here And as we go through the rest of this JSP and servlets couple of videos, I'm going to kind of reveal to you more and more what I've done. So what I've done to kind of start off here is let me jump into my Jakarta directory. So C Jakarta, whoops, and I want to go to my web apps and my RB test directory that we created earlier. Now, you saw the web-inf that I created. Now, what I did here was I dropped in a .jsp file, and I'm going to show it to you. Remember that we're not programming JSP pages just yet, but let me go ahead and open that up. So let me open it up with like Notepad here. And I don't really want you to focus in on the um, syntax right now. The reason why I'm opening it up is because I want to prove to you that I've got some weird kind of syntax in here that looks an awful lot like Java, okay? And that's a JSP file. And then in my web-inf classes, I've got a hello world example.class as well as a test servlet.class file. So I've got a couple of class files in there. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to show you. The next thing I want to show you is in another directory inside of the Jakarta directory, inside of the conf directory. And there's a couple of important files that we're going to talk about here. One is called the server.xml. Now, this original server XML file you see here, this is what came with Jakarta. This is what came with Tomcat when I set it up. And it's a huge XML file. And here's the reality of it. When you start ripping out the comments, you kind of thin it down into what I've renamed aptly a server XML. So what I did was I essentially renamed the original one, original dash server XML, and I stripped out all of the comments, and I look at how small that is here, okay? And I went ahead and have the minimum XML necessary. Now, there is a service name element called an element called service that has the attribute name of value of Catalina. In here, I changed the connector port to port 80. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to do the following. So let me go ahead and start up my server. So I've got it linked to the startup bat file here. And Service Pack 2 kind of screams at me, but I say, yep, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and start her up. Let's see how many milliseconds this will take. 6,159 milliseconds. Not too bad. Now, you see over here, info starting Coyote HTTP 1.1 on port HTTP-80. Let me minimize this and watch what I can do now. If I go to localhost and I go to RB test 1 and I'll do test.html, notice, just give it a second here, that I no longer need my colon 8080 because the default protocol port is 80. So if I'm going to be using a port other than 80, then I have to specify, colon 8080 or whatever port. But because I'm using the default HTTP port, that's fine. So I don't have to specify that, and I configured that in the server.xml. Now check this out. Here's JSP. Okay, and here's the product of my JSP file, and you can see the date is being written in there very dynamically. Now, let me show you this. I created a servlet called my test, and the my test. Notice that there's not a .html or a .html or .jsp. This is being generated by a servlet, which is essentially a class file, a Java application. And I programmed it to generate that HTML for me. So the reason why I've stepped through testing an HTML file, a JSP file, and a servlet is to show you that we are now ready to start digging in to develop and build our own JSPs and our own servlets. But there was a little bit of work we had to do to set up the server for that. In installing and implementing Tomcat for Servlet in JSP Development Part 2, we defined and took a closer look at what we need to do to set up our server for JSP and Servlet development. And we went over exactly the definition of a web app, as well as the all-important critical directory structure, where we have the web-inf, the classes, the lib directory, and the all-important XML file called web.xml. Then I showed you how to create a WAR file. Then I showed you how to go ahead and deploy a very simple test into the directory on the server, into that web-inf classes directory, to verify that we've absolutely got our server running and we can generate servlets and JSP pages. I hope you have found this informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.